Welcome to the Critical Power channel, a year-round programme of original, always-on content exploring the industry's progression on all things power. We bring together the world's leading expert practitioners to share their insights with the wider data centre community and to discuss the most important challenges the data centre industry must address as it grows rapidly. Throughout the year, we have a number of different broadcast plans in this channel, including Critical Power, Backup and Generation, and of course Gridscale. We'll also be launching our channel survey, as well as publishing our Mission Critical Power supplement in the coming months. You can also keep up to date with the latest industry developments by reading our reports that are regularly released on our website. And there are lots more channels you can subscribe to. They've all got broadcasts planned across the year, with many of the industry's leading subject matter experts already participating. You can subscribe to all of these channels online at datacenterdynamics.com, where you'll also find the latest news, editorial features, white papers, and industry opinions. We use the On24 content platform to deliver all our broadcasts. Let me show you around it. Here are the speaker bios. Here's where the slide deck will appear. Here's the media player. Most of our broadcasts use video, and of course all of them have sound. You can adjust the volume here or mute the sound. Here's the resource section with relevant downloads and links. If you've got a question, here's the Q&A widget. Our moderators will try and get an answer during the episode. If they can't fit it in, your question will be forwarded to the speaker to get back to you offline. Some episodes will lead straight into a roundtable discussion. Here's where the link will be. This is a great opportunity to share your own ideas and opinions. For our partner-led episodes, you can even book a meeting through the platform here. And finally, if you've got 2 minutes, we'd love it if you could take part in our channel survey. Here's the link that helps us with future programming. And without that out of the way, let's get started.
Okay, hi there. This is George Rockett, CEO at Data Center Dynamics. It's my honor to have the penultimate session of the day, and it's a fireside discussion with Ed Ansett. How are you doing, Ed?
Good, George. Thank you. You?
Yeah, not bad. I'm a bit coldy at the moment, so excuse me if I blow my nose. I will go on mute. Okay. If you're not familiar with Ed Ansett, Ed's the CEO and founder of i3 Solutions, a very progressive design engineering consultancy working across the world. Ed and I go back 20 years, so I consider him a great friend. So it's always nice to talk with friends because you kind of like got this rapport of an ongoing conversation. So be gentle today, Ed.
Of course, George.
Okay, so what we're here to talk about, the title's The Energy Storage Conundrum and Demand Response and the Shift to Renewables. We're covering a lot of topics, but actually what today's going to focus on is the whole arena of demand response, the responsible use of generators, and it's all part of some ongoing research that i3 Solutions has been doing with a company, EYP Mission Critical, based out of New York. They've produced a number of marvelous papers on the topic of sustainability, GHG abatement, and they're kind of like following their nose with the conversation, producing more and more papers on this. Now, in the resources section here on the page, you will be able to download those papers. And there are a few opinion pieces and things that Ed's written and some other downloads from DCD that all support the conversation today. So as always, if you want to go deeper into the topic, you can go way deeper into the topic. So this is kind of like conversational. Hopefully going to get a load of really good download from Ed here. But again, we haven't got time to tell the whole story. So I'm going to go into my first question, really finding out about renewables. So, Ed, what problem do the increased use of renewables on the grid create? Because this is fundamental, right?
Yeah, okay. So in terms of renewables, the main issues associated with the variable nature of their generating capacity. Now, that's not true of all renewables, such as geothermal and tidal, but certainly when it comes to wind and solar, they are what we call variable renewable energy sources. And that creates a problem because any utility grid has to be able to balance supply and demand constantly. Therefore, if you consider the sun is setting, obviously the solar output is dropping or the winds drop, something on the grid has to respond to that to ensure that the supply and demand are equally matched. Now, that is achieved by bringing other forms of generation or energy storage online to make up the difference as the renewables fall away. So that's very fundamental. And the other thing with renewables is they lack the sort of constant inertia that spinning machines have. So, you know, when you think about conventional generation, nuclear and fossil fuel generation, they are basically continuously providing power. They don't vary according to environmental circumstances. So those.
I've got a little image up here because also it's like the amount of them, right? So you're talking. We've got this issue with intermittency, and we've got lots more of them coming online. You had this in the paper. It's from the IEA, very reputable source, and you know, looking at 2050, the grid mix looks very different. Of course, by location it's different, but overall, you know, this is a different world that we're going to be living in.
Yeah, well, so there's a confluence of two really important factors here. One is the increased amount of renewables that are coming onto grids. Okay, that's one thing. As countries move to decarbonize their grids, and pretty much they all are, with very few exceptions, pretty much every country, and certainly those that are signed up to the Paris Climate Agreement, are decarbonizing their grids. So that in turn is bringing in more renewables as a rule. Generally, that's the way that the countries are compensating, by bringing in more renewables, as I say, variable renewable energy sources. And the other factor, which is very important and sometimes overlooked, is that demand itself is increasing. It's not that demand is flat. So we've got the confluence of those two factors, the variable renewable energy and increase in demand as well, that have to be dealt with.
Okay, interesting. And then
if you go to the next slide, it's a very simplistic slide, but this is really just simply talking about graphically showing, you know, how the grid needs to be balanced, and what happens if there's an undersupply and in some cases an oversupply. But remember, grids have to operate within certain frequency and voltage limits. Usually there's a statutory requirements, but there's safety requirements as well. So balancing supply and demand is not a nice to have for a grid, it's an essential.
And that's really complicated, right? I mean,
it is.
And we hear stories when
it's even more complicated now, because grids, there's so many distributed energy resources. In other words, private companies now generating into the grid. So not only do you have, you know, the conventional grid generation plant, but you've got a lot of these DERs, and some of them things like battery energy storage systems. There could be, you know, turbines available to the grid that can be called on. So yeah, it's a huge complex balancing act. I'm glad I don't have to do it for a living.
Okay, so we've got this complexity and this move to renewables. I just want to bring us on to another area, and I think it's a naive question, but you know, there's an intention behind it. Is energy storage more than just about battery technologies? Because we hear about grid scale batteries and things all of the time, but are they really coming to the rescue, or are they a way off? What's out there from an energy storage perspective that might help this?
So, okay, so when we talk about energy storage, obviously battery energy storage, and that's predominantly lithium ion at the moment. That's likely to change in future as other types of battery technologies sort of make their way into this market. So battery energy storage is needed at grid scale, and there's no sign that that's going to change any day soon. The problem with batteries fundamentally is they're not good at storing energy or rather releasing energy over a long period of time, irrespective of the type of battery. So batteries are really set up to discharge, quite frankly, almost immediately, and then perhaps, you know, up to an hour, maybe more than that. But they're not, batteries are not able to provide days worth of energy storage. So when it comes to an energy storage at grid scale, we really need to be looking at other solutions. And there's stuff coming on the market. I mean, and this no doubt will be available at some point, but it's really not quite ready yet. I mean, liquid air, compressed air, these things have got huge potential. But frankly, we've got a different take on this altogether, which is if we turn to the data center sector and say, hey, how about you, data center sector, you provide the energy storage through some form of demand response scheme. There is so much data center energy capacity available that could meaningfully make a big difference to the energy equilibrium in terms of supply and demand. A very big difference. We're talking gigawatts worth of energy storage when we look at the generating capacity and the ability of data centers to run autonomously.
Interesting. So we did you, I, and Lex Coors. We did a fireside chat, I think, at the back end of last year, about diesel generators, and I think we used a number from Tech UK, which was the UK had 2 gigawatts of diesel generator install base in data centers. It was something like that. So the idea that those generators are hooked up to fuel tanks that have fuel for that. If not, there would be no point. Are you kind of like saying we view the data center itself as an energy storage, as a battery of sorts that's on a network?
Yeah, but people perhaps haven't been given all the information they need and think, hey, you can't run your diesel generators and just, take your data center offline, run up your diesel generator. You're polluting the environment. And if that were the case and we're using conventional diesel, I would agree. But what we're saying is, why have you got to use conventional diesel? Why don't you use a biofuel? And one that we see as being most attractive to the industry is HVO, for reasons which I can explain. But why not use a biofuel, which is basically a carbon circular fuel? It's not a fossil fuel. Yes, of course, it's got emissions, but that is part of a circular carbon cycle because it's biofuel. And use a fuel like that, and in that way, and we'll be publishing a paper on this soon to quantify all of this stuff, you can actually reduce the overall carbon footprint, particularly if you look at this collectively and get all the operators to kind of get involved in this. We could do things like massively reduce something called marginal emissions and reduce the overall carbon footprint of a country. So I think this is something we really need to look at quite carefully.
Okay, I think that's the area that we're going to go in a bit, because there's lots of examples and so I've got lots of questions. But before we jump down there, can you just do a little job of explaining, I got my question up there, can you explain the different types of demand response programs and what's more suited to data center operators in general, so we can just kind of like get or help me get my level of knowledge up?
Okay, so we can. I think you can really put demand response in 2 baskets, really. And there are lots of programs, and different countries use different names for different programs. So I'm going to just try to summarize it into two main baskets. One is operating reserve. Okay, this is principally where the data center disconnects this in its simplest form. It's what all data centers can do this already. They simply disconnect from the grid and they run under their own steam, using their own generators, as we would like to see it, using a biofuel. So HVO is the fuel we're talking about. The other type is basically frequency containment. Okay, frequency containment, as opposed to operating reserve, frequency containment is more about short-term grid stability. As the name suggests, it's about bringing about frequency stability to the grid itself. So things like battery energy storage are well suited to frequency containment. Battery storage is not as well suited to operating reserve, because operating reserve can be sometimes means running for hours. In some cases, Texas, for example, possibly even running for days. So that's how I broadly group the two types of demand response. As I say, there are lots of different flavors. Frequency containment, as you can see there, has got 3 different types of in this example anyway, 3 different types of frequency containment. Yes, if we go on to the next slide, you'll see that. And this is these different types of frequency containment, whether they're fast frequency response or frequency containment reserve, frequency restoration, they're all associated with different response times and different duration. So, they provide different services that the grid needs to respond to and ensure that the frequency of the grid is stabilized. So it's very important. That's really battery energy storage, operating reserve. That's more about running your engines.
Okay, this starts to make sense. I remember reading in the paper, which is available for download down there, that the financial reward goes up the faster you can respond, right? So,
well, I think I broadly categorize it as this, and again, I've got to keep broadly categorizing because these systems do vary a lot from country to country. But broadly speaking, if you're operating in real time, as opposed to what they call day ahead services, where you're planning a day ahead, yes, the financial rewards tend to be better in real time, something that's available to the grid whenever the grid wants, as opposed to being forewarned with a reasonable warning period, is obviously more valuable to the grid.
Okay, and that explains why there has been quite a lot of investment in the past on these battery farms linked to the grid that cost a hell of a lot of money, but they can be very fast to respond. So they're fast frequency response where they do these big batteries.
Well, batteries can do all of these different 3 types of frequency response. Okay, but right. I mean, batteries can connect to the grid very quickly. They can connect to the grid theoretically, in the millisecond level.
Okay, so let's go into.
Sorry, George, I should also say you've been talking about grid scale battery energy storage, but what we're seeing now with some of the more progressive organizations is battery energy storage being used by the data center itself, okay, to provide demand response services. So not on the grid side, but on the consumer side. Behind the meter is the term. So we're seeing battery energy storage now being deployed. It's not just chit chat, it's actual, and these are large systems are being deployed by data center owners.
So we had a session earlier on this program, I think with Vertiv, looking at that. And again, I noticed on the paper you said that the majority of the large significant vendors have that capability within the UPSs that they're selling, right? So this is the capabilities there, right? Just the acceptance.
Yeah, I mean, Eaton, Vertiv, Schneider, ABB, they've seen this coming for a long time. I don't remember which of them was first to come up with the idea of grid interactive UPS, but the fact of the matter is all of these big corporates do see there's an opportunity for UPSs to basically be better utilized. They've seen an opportunity for the UPS to do things, and it could be exporting energy, it could be absorbing energy, it could be simply supplying the IT load for an interval whilst we disconnect from the utility or partially disconnect. They've seen this coming, and I think they're absolutely right.
Interesting. Okay, so let's kind of like go further down the area we wanted to look at. We've spoken about demand response, and I'd like to be educated a bit on GHG abatement, which has been a core of your research activities with i3 and EYP. You already touched upon, you mentioned marginal emissions. I think that warrants a lot deeper explanation, but can we just talk about, in general, demand response and the GHG abatement opportunity?
Well, this is really central to us, because our whole program is around greenhouse gas abatement and the application of various technologies that are in the market to achieve some form of greenhouse gas abatement in a data center context. That's the whole group's looking at that, and looking at many different subject areas. Personal professional for me is on the demand response side. The whole thing about this, and the reason we're interested in demand response is not, demand response is not new. Demand response to data centers is new, and the opportunity there, the key thing, is an opportunity for data center operators to do something about carbon emissions. Part of the problem right now is the way that people have to do carbon accounting. They're required to account for their own carbon footprint. One of the things that needs to be looked at a little bit carefully in terms of how carbon reporting is done is that if you're involved in demand response, then you're doing something upstream. You just remember that we've got to balance supply and demand. So we only need 1 kilowatt of additional demand, and then suddenly we need to bring on a fossil fuel plant, a dirty one, an oil one or coal one, just to satisfy that need as we tip the balance. Okay, that may be a slight exaggeration, but the point is, the data centers are able to support the grid by, for example, battery energy storage, or running their machines, their emergency generators, using clean fuel. This is an opportunity to avoid marginal emissions, and marginal emissions are very, very important, because you can just imagine how much the carbon footprint of a country goes up when it starts up one of its older fossil fuel plants. You can stop that happening by lining up a few data center organizations, say, right, we're going to disconnect from the grid. That coal power station doesn't need to start. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. That's what we're talking about here. You're on mute, George.
It happens to the best of us, Ed. Yeah, we've got a slide about this which really shows the impact. So this is really interesting. Can you talk us through this a bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is simply the emission factors. Emission factors are measured in carbon equivalent, or the amount of grams or kilograms of carbon equivalent. So that's just not carbon dioxide, it's NOx and it's SOx gases as well, particulate emissions. These are all rounded up into a kind of a blob called CO2e, carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's measured per unit energy. And what you can see, it's obvious really, is that when this is really, this graph simply shows what the emission factors are of PV and wind, and sometimes people think these renewable energy sources are carbon free. Well, they're not. They might be while they're operating, but they're not to produce, so they've got a carbon footprint, but it's pretty damn small. And then we start to get into combined cycle gas turbine, in other words, natural gas, and suddenly our emissions are up in the sort of 400 grams of carbon. And then when we bring in oil, which is not the dirtiest, we've got coal was worse than that, then the carbon emissions go through the roof. So we need to do, when we're looking at carbon abatement, it's about trying to kind of push these things back, okay, to delay for as long as possible. And grids operate in this way anyway. Grids naturally bring on the most efficient and cost-effective forms of generation, which is typically renewables, followed by they will always keep a base load of nuclear or possibly even CCGT. But that's the way the grid tends to work. It brings on, and then will bring on its oil plant and its coal-fired plant as a matter of last resort. So, as I say, if the data centers could collectively agree that they're going to support a carbon abatement, then the simplest way of doing it is to disconnect from the grid, run on a clean fuel, and your carbon emissions, and talking about national carbon emissions, could be significantly less when you look at the possible marginal emissions. You're on mute again, George.
Is there a way, Ed, of recording the marginal emissions avoided for a company to use in their end of year report? Because I always hear sometimes that people don't do things because no way, it's like carbon avoidance and things like that.
Yeah, well, the answer is yes, but like a lot of things, quite complex, because you'd need to look at it firstly on a country by country basis, and then you'd need to look at it from a time of year perspective, and there'd be all these other factors. That's no excuse for not doing it. and something that in the next paper that's coming at the next paper on demand response, where we're looking to quantify some of the benefits, carbon benefits as well, then we're certainly going to have a crack at that, trying to give some examples of what that might be.
So that's a really interesting notion, isn't it? I was on the M4 yesterday, taking some visitors to Windsor, and I can't help a little bit of bit of data center info as you go along, and I saw the power station there, and for historical reasons, Slough has become a UK mecca for data centers, right? And they've got the power station there for all the the reasons of I think the original Mars factory in the Golden Triangle, that it was at the time in the 50s the biggest industrial estate in Europe, and those industries have gone, and now there's data centers there. So do you look at this in a potential of an area of data centers being able to do this, or is it ultimately something that one looks at a national level? The UK data center community has got together to do this, and it can be its results and rewards can be national. I'm looking in a utopian way.
Listen, if you look at it from a utopian point of view, people would put their hands up to do it and say, yeah, we're going to do that. But then people have got genuine concerns about data center participation in demand response. So, I think things are going to come to a head. I don't know when governments say, firstly, when governments really wake up to this. I wasn't aware of this whole potential of data centers until about a year or so ago. And I read a paper where somebody had written, his name eludes me at the moment, it was all to do with what people used to be looking at, which was load shifting, which is to try to migrate IT loads from one location to another, and to affect things that way. And they basically said that when governments wake up to the idea that they are sitting on and the data center industry wakes up to the fact that they're sitting on tens, if not hundreds of millions of upside financial opportunity and positive greenhouse gas impact, things are going to change. That light bulb moment hasn't happened yet.
Okay, no, but it's a big and it's a profound story. So let's go on our little story here as well. So we spoke before about the different types of demand response. We've got that graph we can put, the chart we can pull up again in a bit. Which are the big opportunities for data center operators? I know they're different in different places, but just an idea of, you've spoken about load shifting and things. What's being used or what should be used?
Okay, so I think it varies geographically. Okay,
of course.
If, for example, you take the UK and Ireland, the UK and Ireland, and to an extent the Nordics, have a very profound need for frequency response, unlike perhaps the United States, where frequency response programs are not as prevalent. And the reason for that is they've got a highly connected, very large grid. Whereas UK, Ireland, effectively, yes, there are interconnects with mainland Europe, but they're fairly flaky in terms of the size of the respective grids of Ireland, UK, and so on. So what I mean by flaky is that, in terms of capacity, there's not sufficient capacity. And yes, there's talking about more capacity and interconnects and one thing or another. But frequency response is well underway and well established in Western Europe. The main opportunity, though, for particularly in the US and Canada, is operating reserve. That's not to say there aren't frequency response programs; they are, but based on what the information we have at the moment, it's not as pervasive as it is in Europe.
Forgive me, on here, which one would be operating reserve?
Store. So that's that's short-term operating reserve.
Okay. Yeah, I've got you. Sorry.
So load shifting and load curtailment, and that's really to do with having the ability to control the IT load. And this is something that's come up recently in Amsterdam, where Amsterdam are telling operators that they want. I know I'm not pieced a little bit here, but they want operators to invoke sleep states. And the operators say, well, we can't control the end users, right? Well, we can head that one off here. I'm not talking about data center operators getting involved in load shifting or load curtailment. That's an end user function. But short-term operating reserve and the other three frequency programs, yeah, data center operators can control their own destiny.
Okay, interesting. And you said this is excuse me, a subject of your next paper in more detail, right? But you did some work, or you reached out to an aggregator, right? That's
we're working with Voltus in the United States and Canada. The problem we had is we knew that there were revenue generating opportunities for data center operators, and we needed to work with an organization, a credible organization, that can help us work out what those kind of opportunities were. Because participation in demand response, from our perspective, our main driver is greenhouse gas abatement. But if you're an operator, yes, you might be a benevolent operator, but at the end of the day, there has to be some kind of financial incentive as well. So Voltus have worked with us and worked with us on a couple of other topics as well that will contribute to this next paper. Could you bring the Voltus slide up, George?
I'd love to. So would everyone else. No, it's a really interesting slide. So let's dig into this. So this is, so first of all, Ed, and there's two ways. So a company can do demand response on their own, generally if they're very big, or they can work with an aggregator that comes in and makes life easier for them, right? Is that the basic?
Well, I think in principle that's right. But I think from the data center operator perspective, we'll put aside the very, very large data center companies now that have got massive portfolio. They probably could go it alone. I think for most data center operators, it makes sense to go through an aggregator. Yes, there's a price to pay in terms of, the aggregator takes some of the income, but also the aggregator generally shields you from the risk. So if you don't fulfill an obligation, which is what sometimes people worry about when I talk to them about demand response, what if we don't? I can't run a budget. What if we, what if we have it? What if this happens? What if that happens? Most aggregators that I've spoken to will shield the data center operator from those penalties because they've got a large enough portfolio and they can pull on another resource somewhere to fill the gap, as it were. But what this slide is about, so what we did, what Voltus did, is they took three areas: Virginia, Texas, and Ontario, Canada, and looked at the operating reserve programs that exist in those locations. And they vary, as you can see, in terms of what the, excuse me, I think I've caught it from you now, George. In terms of what the compensation is from the utility, how much you get paid, it varies according to where you are, with Ontario being, by far the most generous, as it were, and Virginia the least. But nonetheless, if you do the math and you work out, if you're an X megawatt data center operator and you were willing to participate in these programs, this is the kind of revenue that you're going to see. And the other point to bear in mind here is that these programs are stackable. Okay, so if you take Texas, you've got three programs that you can participate in all three simultaneously. And principally, what does this mean? What people really want to know is, well, what does this mean to me? You're not even doing anything fancy in terms of demand response. All you're doing is disconnecting from the grid and running on your generators. Well, guess what? That's what data centers do well. They all can do that. There isn't a single one I've ever worked on that couldn't do that. So the opportunity is there. The key is, from our perspective, environmental. These guys don't require you to run on the biofuels such as HVO. You can run your diesels. Not so great. So from our perspective, we're thinking, well, as long as you run on a clean fuel, then let's get into this, because then you have a benefit to society as a whole in terms of greenhouse gas abatement, and you'll have an income. And that might vary from a couple of million to tens of millions per annum of additional income just by participating. And that doesn't mean you will run your generators. It means you might. And, you can see here on the slide what it means for each of the programs, what the requirements are, how likely they are to require you to start your gens and for what period and so on. But I just don't see, the naysayers who say, well, you can't participate in demand response. This is the simplest form of demand response participation there is that I know of. Data centers can all do it, no exceptions. And from our perspective, as I say, and I think from many others' perspective, if you're doing it in a clean and renewable way, can't think of any good reason why you wouldn't do it. Can you?
It's eye-watering. I mean, it's interesting, because you talk about, the diesel fuel alternatives, which we'll go into in a bit. But if you were, there is an argument to say if you were running diesel, but from a marginal emission way, it stopped a coal-fired power station coming on, there could be an argument that there's a GHG positive out of this, couldn't there be?
And so how could that be? What do you mean by that?
Well, let's say that because your data center is in this program and a new energy source doesn't have to be built, and that might be built because it's coal in a place. I'm talking.
I see what you mean.
In an extreme sense.
Yeah. Okay. So this is something that Voltas have been talking to us about. It's the benefits are more wide ranging than the ones that I've just mentioned. You're also now talking about potentially the ability to offset completely a new build program. To mean it doesn't happen, and that might be building of a power plant, that might be building a part of a transmission network, a distribution network, all of these things. Voltas mentioned these things to me, and we all kind of scratched our head and said, well, how do we quantify that? So we haven't quite figured that out. But these are good points.
Yeah. And I think I remember speaking in the past, some of the big companies that do the investment into energy infrastructure, like Capital Dynamics and Generate, they're looking at this as well, right? They're looking at the data center as a client within, an energy ecosystem for exactly that reason. It means that less has to be built out in general.
We've kind of decided at the moment, for the purposes of the paper, it's kind of in our too hard basket to quantify it.
Yeah.
And also it might be a bit of a reach, because when we write these papers, the industry, but possibly some people listening, very cynical, a little bit unbelieving about all of this. What's this Ansett guy talking about now? This is something that we've really thought through here. And it's not just my opinion, it's the opinion of quite a few people that, this I can understand why some form of demand response might be less appealing. If you're having to inject energy into the grid, battery energy storage aside, using your generators to generate into the grid, to actively power the grid, maybe that's a bridge too far for some people. But in terms of operating in island mode, operating reserve, I don't see what the option that could be.
So it brings us on kind of like to, this question. It's my final question, probably a lot to discuss in it, right? What's holding the industry back from joining demand response programs? I guess, like we said earlier, there's a regional aspect to it, but there isn't. There's also just a mission critical engineering aspect to it, isn't there? So what do you get from people? Because like you said, you put your head above the parapet quite often writing these papers, and somebody's always going to be a naysayer and go, well, I don't believe this and that, and I tried this back in 1978 and it didn't work, and you get that all the time.
I can think of a few people. Quite right.
What do you know?
What's holding them back?
Yeah.
Okay. So, firstly, there is a genuine concern that we, as a data center operator, are worried that we may somehow risk the operation of our data center by participating in demand response. Okay, that's a concern that you hear a lot. Another one is, and again, it's very geography dependent. I mentioned that a couple of times. the demand response programs are still evolving around the world. You know, even in the most developed economies, the programs are constantly evolving. New programs are being thought up. Old ones retired. One or two countries, more than one, some countries don't even have a demand response program. Okay, and then maybe an organization looks at this and says, well, it's not, you know, it's just not worth the risk. I'm going to earn $5 million extra a year for my data center, but I don't trust the utility. I heard, was it somebody said to me, they were worried about hacking, which I found extraordinarily interesting. I was going to say funny, but I wouldn't say that. Yeah, those are the kind of reasons you hear. So it's risk. It's like, you know, the ability of programs, the availability of programs, and I think also, you know what our industry's like. Okay, so we all used to design 2N power systems, and you could never do anything else. We all forget about that because practically nobody designs a 2N power system anymore. It's different variants of an N+1. How did that change happen? Well, that was driven by end user behavior. And that's what it's going to take here. We need to get some momentum into this. We need big organizations, and you know who you are if you're listening, big organizations, you need to take the lead on this so the data center operators can follow. I heard it said by one data center operator, we can't do that. Our SLAs won't allow it. Perfectly true. Certainly existing SLAs won't have any provision for demand response. But that isn't to say that new ones couldn't. And again, it needs end user help because they need to allow data center operators to participate in this for the greater good. So those are the obstacles.
Interesting. Again, in the paper, which is available for download, there was this other idea of why you would do it is because every new organization that comes on in the world to build data centers, for them, it might be a competitive advantage, right? On cost, it might be an ability to find.
You asked me why people wouldn't do it, not why they would do it.
Yeah, no. Well, of course, when you ask why you wouldn't, why would they as well? I mean, we can.
Oh, you're right. I mean, you know, the people that we're involved with that are looking at this are the newer firms that are looking to sort of, you know, gain a position by doing something which is different and good for the environment.
Yeah, it makes sense. You can imagine it as a piece of marketing on the website. You know, for the right customers, you will be part of a demand response and help your local energy grid do X, Y, and Z. And there might be people that say, "Well, that's what I want to do."
I think, in fairness, George, the other thing is that, in fairness to the data center community, is there's not enough data out there. I mean, we're writing this paper or these papers, not being mean to everyone else, but where's the rest of the papers? You know, if we expect the community to respond, there needs to be a lot more input from other people in terms of either agreeing or disagreeing with the point that this has got a GHG benefit.
I've got a little slide to end on. We asked this question last year because this is a grid scale event, and we had the first broadcast last year where we split out just from critical power and said we needed something about, you know, the grid interactive data center. We needed to build out that discussion, and we asked a series of questions. Again, this is available for download in the resources section, but also there's a button here asking you to answer this year's questions. I think there's 7 or 8 questions, and if you answer them, you'll be the first to receive the report. But anyway, this question we have been asking, I think since 2008, it says, so a long time. And I asked Nick Parfitt, who wrote something up on the side there, his comment. Energy security is ranked number 1 as the biggest energy-related concern for data centers, and environmental sustainability has always been ranked lowest when it comes to security, cost, and environmental sustainability. This is, you know, that nearly 100 people answered this that were tuning in, right, to tuning into last year's session. So they're people that really, you know, were concerned with the whole area of critical power. And I guess this is one of the barriers, right? Is you build a data center for it to be available all the time, and you build it in a highly reliable way. But I guess there's a time when this changes, right? Maybe this
listen,
is.
they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Again, this is kind of this. I'm not trying to make light of this. Energy security is likely to be the single most important factor for the foreseeable future. I mean, at the end of the day, fundamentally, in terms of data center operators, what do they do? They provide space, power, and cooling. They're equally important. Well, but one of them is very potentially the least unstable. Power. You only get a few milliseconds of power off, and you've got an outage, right? So, energy security is undoubtedly right up there. The problem I have is I don't see at the moment any scientific argument that says that you cannot participate in demand response and maintain exactly the same level of energy security. Just don't see it. And there is even an argument, which I believe it's true, that you could even see enhanced levels of energy security if you participate in these programs.
Really interesting, and that's maybe an interesting point to conclude our conversation. We've packed a lot of information there, Ed. Thank you, as always, for the contribution you make with this type of information, this way of viewing the market. It's very progressive, as always, and as we've always said, it takes time for an industry to move, but it's headed in that direction for so many different drivers pushing it there. One of them will ultimately be regulation in the future that impacts in different ways. There are lots of papers to download. I've spoken to you about that all the way through this session. So really, there's lots of information to be able to make your mind up. If you've asked a question during the session, I saw one pop up about 3 minutes ago. It didn't fit into where we were discussing at that moment in time, but we'll forward those questions over to Ed. And just a quick intro as well for the last session of the day. There'll be a slide up about it in a minute, but the last session of the day are some technology showcases and some innovation. So these are our little roundups of products that are innovative that we tag on the end of these broadcasts, where a vendor takes you through how they work and what's going on. So stick around for that, or look at it on demand. Well, anyway, from me, it's goodbye. Ed, it's thank you very much.
It's goodbye from him.
It's goodbye for him and goodbye from me, right?
See ya.
On that note, we'll end. I hope you've enjoyed this year's DCD Grid Scale. There's lots and lots of information and links online on the Critical Power channel, which I hope you subscribe to, because it gives you a front of house and all the great work that we're doing. We've got papers to download. We've got supplements that are coming out regularly, research that's coming out. And if you're a subscriber to that channel, you get all of this first. Anyway, thanks a lot. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.